The camera flash exploded in Richard Chandler's face just as he adjusted his bow tie in the mirror of the Grand Imperial Hotel in Manhattan. Sophia Monroe, dressed in a provocative black gown that cost more than most people earned in 6 months, kissed his neck, leaving a lipstick mark he'd need to wipe off before they went down to the ballroom. 3 years. 3 years since he had made those solemn vows in a discreet Brooklyn chapel, promising to love and honor Isabel Hartley. 3 years keeping her hidden like a shameful secret in their modest Queen's apartment, while Sophia shone on his arm at every event in New York high society. The irony wasn't lost on him. Isabel, with her master's degree in literature and her ability to discuss any subject with natural eloquence, had been deliberately kept out of his public life. Richard had invented endless excuses for his family and social circle. She was ill. She had social phobia. She preferred the quiet of home. The truth was simpler and crueler. Isabel didn't come from money, and that, in Richard's world, was an unforgivable sin. Sophia slid her fingers along the lapel of his tuxedo, her emerald green eyes sparkling with the anticipation of another night of being admired, photographed, and envied. She didn't know about Isabel. No one did, except Richard's lawyer and his older brother, Christopher, who had repeatedly warned that the charade would eventually implode. The Sterling Foundation's Winter Charity Gala was the most anticipated event of New York's social season. Millionaires, CEOs, celebrities, and the political elite converged on the ballroom, which looked like it had stepped out of a European fairy tale with its bohemian crystal chandeliers and imported marble columns. Richard had waited months for this night. His father, the ruthless Victor Chandler, would finally announce his succession to the presidency of Chandler Industries, an investment empire valued in the billions. As they entered the ballroom, heads immediately turned. Sophia knew how to work a room, greeting important people with the calculated familiarity of someone who had spent their life climbing the social hierarchy. Richard felt the approving weight of their gazes. This was the perfect picture he had meticulously painted, the successful heir with the stunning woman by his side. Victor Chandler watched from across the ballroom, a glass of bourbon in hand, surrounded by industry magnates. His approving gaze as it landed on Richard and Sophia was everything his son had ever wanted. Acceptance, pride, recognition. Meanwhile, 22 miles away, Isabel Hartley sat on the veranda of a Long Island mansion that made the Grand Imperial Hotel look modest by comparison. Marcus Anderson, at 42, was one of America's wealthiest men, having built a tech empire from the ground up. Tall, with graying temples and piercing blue eyes, he had met Isabel 6 months ago quite by accident. She was at the Queen's Public Library, where she volunteered 3 times a week, when Marcus walked in, looking for a rare first edition of Hemingway. They had talked for 2 hours about literature, philosophy, and the irony of seeking real connections in an increasingly digital world. He didn't know she was married. She didn't know who he was until she saw him on the cover of Forbes a week later. When they finally met again, at a small coffee shop where Marcus liked to escape the pressure of his corporate world, Isabel had been honest about her situation. She told him about Richard, about the 3 years of their phantom marriage, about how she felt like a prisoner in her own relationship. Marcus listened without judgment and then made a proposal that left her speechless. Now, in the red dress Marcus had insisted on buying for her, so different from the simple clothes she wore daily, Isabel looked at her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her dark brown hair was styled in elegant waves, her makeup accentuated her almond-shaped eyes, and the Italian silk gown molded her body in a way that made her feel powerful for the first time in years. Marcus appeared behind her in the mirror's reflection, impeccable in his tailor-made tuxedo. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his deep voice carrying genuine concern. Isabel took a deep breath. "I've spent 3 years being invisible. I think it's more than time to be seen." The drive to Manhattan was filled with comfortable silence. Marcus didn't try to convince her of anything, made no grand promises or dramatic declarations. He simply offered his presence and support, something Richard had never truly done. When the limousine pulled up in front of the Grand Imperial Hotel, Isabel felt her heart quicken. Photographers lined the entrance, flashes exploding like fireworks as they captured the arrival of every celebrity and magnate. Marcus stepped out first, extending a hand to help her. The moment her feet touched the red carpet, the buzz noticeably intensified. Marcus Anderson rarely appeared at public events, and never in his entire high-profile career had he arrived with a companion. The stunning woman on his arm immediately became the focus of intense curiosity. Who was she? Where had she come from? Photographers shouted requests for them to look at cameras. Social reporters rapidly spoke into their cell phones, updating blogs and social media in real time. Inside the ballroom, Richard was in the middle of a conversation with potential investors when he felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, like a wave forming on the horizon before gaining strength. Conversations quieted, people began to turn towards the entrance, and then silence spread through the ballroom like dominoes falling in sequence. Richard turned, annoyed by the interruption, and his champagne glass almost slipped from his hand. Isabel stood at the entrance of the ballroom, a vision in red, with Marcus Anderson by her side. She wasn't just present. She commanded the space in a way that made Richard question if he had ever truly known his wife. Her eyes met his across the crowd, and in them he saw something that chilled him to the bone. There was no anger there, no hurt. There was resolution, determination, and perhaps most frightening of all, there was power. Sophia noticed the tension in Richard's body and followed his gaze. "Who is that?" she whispered, unable to disguise the note of insecurity in her voice. Richard couldn't answer. His throat was dry, his brain struggling to process the impossibility of the scene before him. How did Isabel know about this event? How had she gotten an invitation? And for God's sake, how had she managed to catch Marcus Anderson's attention? Victor Chandler approached his son, his expression as controlled as ever, but Richard could see the question in his eyes. Christopher appeared on the other side, his face a mask of "I told you so." Marcus and Isabel began to descend the steps into the main ballroom, and the crowd naturally parted. Important people Richard had spent years trying to impress, nodded respectfully to Marcus and looked at Isabel with fascinated curiosity. Richard's carefully constructed world, with its meticulously maintained lies and perfectly polished image, began to crack. And as Isabel walked toward him, with the grace of someone who had finally found her place in the world, Richard realized a devastating truth. He hadn't hidden Isabel to protect his reputation. He had hidden her because, on some deep and disturbing level, he had always known she would completely overshadow him. The air in the ballroom seemed to have been sucked out all at once. Richard felt the weight of hundreds of gazes alternating between him, Sophia, and the impossible vision that was Isabel walking through the ballroom as if she had always belonged in that world. Every step she took in her Louboutin heels echoed in his mind like a countdown to an imminent disaster. Marcus Anderson guided Isabel with his hand gently placed on her back, a gesture that managed to be both protective and respectful. Richard watched with growing horror as industry and political giants approached to greet them. Gerald Rothschild, the real estate magnate Richard had tried to impress for 6 months, kissed Isabel's hand as if she were European royalty. Catherine Wu, the editor-in-chief of the East Coast's most influential fashion magazine, was already whispering into her assistant's ear, surely making mental notes about Isabel's dress for the next issue. Sophia squeezed Richard's arm. her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his tuxedo. "Richard, who the hell is that woman? Everyone's looking at her like she's the second coming of Christ." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. How could he explain? 3 years of meticulously constructed lies were about to collapse like a house of cards in a strong wind. He could see Christopher watching from across the ballroom, a mix of concern and resignation on his face. His brother had warned him about this, repeatedly. Victor Chandler materialized beside his son, his bourbon still untouched in his hand. The family patriarch had that unnerving ability to appear at the most inconvenient moments. His voice was low, but carried the weight of a military order. "Explain to me, Richard, why Marcus Anderson is looking our way as if he knows you personally, and why that young woman beside him has the same expression your mother used to have when she caught me lying about business meetings." Before Richard could formulate a response, Marcus and Isabel began to move directly toward them. The ballroom, which moments ago had buzzed with lively conversations about corporate mergers and political scandals, had transformed into a silent theater where everyone awaited the next act of a drama whose magnitude they didn't yet fully comprehend. Isabel maintained her erect posture, her chin lifted with a dignity Richard had never noticed during their years of marriage. Or perhaps he simply hadn't paid enough attention. She wore that red gown like armor, and there was something in her eyes that was simultaneously familiar and utterly strange. It was Isabel, but not the Isabel he had left alone countless nights in the Queen's apartment. This version of her had found something the old one had never possessed: absolute confidence. When they finally stood face to face, the silence in the ballroom was so absolute that Richard could hear the distant clinking of glasses at the bar. Marcus spoke first, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. "Richard Chandler, I've heard a lot about you." The tone was neutral, but there were layers of meaning in those few words that made Richard's stomach churn. Isabel had told him, of course she had, and Marcus Anderson, with all the world's resources at his disposal, probably knew more about Richard than Richard himself would like. Isabel's eyes finally met Sophia's, who was still clinging to Richard's arm as if her life depended on it. For a fleeting moment, Richard saw something akin to pity cross Isabel's face. Not anger, not jealousy, just a melancholic understanding from one woman who recognized another caught in Richard's web of lies. "Sophia Monroe," Isabel said, extending her hand with a grace that seemed to have been practiced in European drawing rooms. "I've heard a lot about you too. Your work at the Whitmore Gallery is quite impressive." Sophia took Isabel's hand automatically, her confusion evident in every line of her perfectly contoured face. "Thank you, I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've been formally introduced." Isabel smiled, and there was a quality to that smile that made Richard want to disappear through the marble floor. It was the smile of someone holding all the cards and simply waiting for the right moment to lay them on the table. "No, we haven't been introduced," Isabel agreed, releasing Sophia's hand and turning to face Richard directly. "But I believe my husband can remedy that now." The world stopped. Sophia blinked, processing the words as if they were in another language. Victor Chandler, for the first time in decades, looked genuinely surprised. Christopher closed his eyes briefly, as if saying a silent prayer. And around them, the ballroom erupted in frantic whispers that grew in volume until they became an unmistakable roar. "You're... what?" Sophia released Richard's arm as if it were on fire, taking a step back. Her face, usually so controlled, was pale beneath her professional makeup. "Richard, she's joking, isn't she? This is some kind of sick joke." Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish out of water, and a distant part of his mind recognized the irony of drowning in public, surrounded by hundreds of people. Marcus observed the scene with a neutral expression, but his eyes were sharp, cataloguing every reaction, every micro-expression. He positioned himself slightly closer to Isabel, a subtle movement that any trained observer would recognize as protective. "Isabel!" Victor's voice cut through the growing chaos, strong and authoritative. He was looking at her with renewed interest, completely re-evaluating the situation. "Isabel Chandler, I presume, or have you kept your maiden name?" "Hartley," Isabel replied, meeting the gaze of the father-in-law she had never personally met. "I've always kept Hartley. It seemed more honest, considering the marriage itself was more of a formality than a reality." Victor had the decency to look slightly impressed. He had always respected people who could hold their own in a verbal battle, and Isabel was clearly not there to be intimidated. "Father," Richard finally found his voice, though it sounded strangled and desperate. "I can explain this. There's context you don't understand." "Context?" Isabel turned to him, and Richard finally saw a flicker of emotion break through her calm facade. It wasn't exactly anger, it was something deeper, more painful. It was the accumulated pain of 3 years of neglect and humiliation. Or what possible context justifies 3 years, Richard? 3 years keeping me hidden, as if I was something to be ashamed of. 3 years cancelling plans at the last minute because someone important might be there. 3 years watching you walk out that door knowing exactly you were going into her arms. She gestured toward Sophia, who was now visibly trembling, her hands covering her mouth in growing horror. "I didn't know," Sophia whispered, tears beginning to smudge her flawless makeup. "Richard, you told me you were divorced. You told me your ex-wife had gone back to England. I would never." "Of course you didn't know," Isabel said, her voice softening slightly. "He's very good at lying. Years of practice, I suppose." Richard felt the ground disappearing beneath his feet. Around them, smartphones had been discreetly raised, capturing every second of that public disaster. He could see the headlines forming in his mind. Chandler Industries, heir exposed as bigamist at charity gala. Marcus Anderson appears with investment magnate's secret wife. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was evaporating before his eyes. Christopher finally approached, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder in a gesture that was both supportive and resigned. "I think we need to talk in private," he murmured. "All of us. Now." Marcus inclined his head slightly. "There's a private conference room on the 10th floor. I'm sure the manager wouldn't mind lending it to us for a few minutes." He looked at Isabel. "But only if you're comfortable with it." Isabel took a deep breath, her shoulders adjusting beneath the crimson fabric of her gown. 3 years, waiting for an honest conversation. I don't think a few more minutes will make a difference. Victor Chandler observed the exchange with calculating eyes, already processing the legal, financial, and social implications of the bomb that had just exploded in his carefully constructed empire. He nodded briefly. The conference room on the 10th floor of the Grand Imperial Hotel was a stark contrast to the opulence of the ballroom below. Dark wood-paneled walls, an elongated polished mahogany table, and leather chairs that probably cost more than Isabel's car. But there was something about the enclosed space that made everything feel more real, more suffocating. There was no audience here, no camera flashes to capture the moment. Just raw, naked truths waiting to be unearthed. Marcus had discreetly positioned himself near the window, giving space to the Chandler family, but remaining within Isabel's sight. His presence was like a silent anchor, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this moment she had mentally rehearsed hundreds of times over the past 6 months. Victor Chandler took the head of the table with the natural ease of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Christopher stood near the door, as if deciding whether to stay and witness the shipwreck or run while there was still time. Sophia had refused to come up, her last words to Richard being a choked, "You disgust me," between sobs, before disappearing toward the hotel exit. Only Richard and Isabel remained, seated on opposite sides of the table, with 3 years of lies and resentment between them. The silence stretched for long seconds before Victor finally spoke, his voice maintaining that controlled tone that had intimidated business adversaries for decades. "Isabel, I'll be direct with you because you clearly deserve at least that. My son has made very serious mistakes, and there is no excuse for the treatment you've received, but I need to understand your intentions. Are you seeking financial compensation, a settlement? Because if so, I can assure you'll be treated fairly." Isabel met his gaze without wavering. For 3 years, she had imagined this man as an almost mythological figure based on the stories Richard told. Victor Chandler, the ruthless investment magnate who had built an empire from nothing, who expected perfection from his children and tolerated no weakness. Face to face with him, Isabel saw disturbing similarities to Richard. The same strong bone structure, the same eyes that could be both charming and icy. But there was something more to Victor, a kind of brutal honesty that Richard had never possessed. Respect, actually, Isabel replied calmly. 3 years ago, your son asked me to marry him in a small Brooklyn cafe. He said he loved me, that he wanted to build a life with me. I believed him. I was naive enough to think that when he said, "for better or worse," he actually meant it. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't interrupt her. His eyes were fixed on the polished surface of the table, unable to meet the accusing gaze of anyone in the room. On our honeymoon, which we spent in a cheap motel in Atlantic City because Richard said he was on a tight budget due to investments, Isabel continued, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed, he received a call. "A family emergency," he said. "He needed to return immediately." I understood, of course. Family is important. But when we got back, things changed. He started working late, later and later. Weekends disappeared into last-minute business trips. And every time I suggested meeting his family, there was a new excuse. His mother was ill, his father was traveling. It wasn't the right time. Christopher